She wasn't a singer or a manager. She wasn't a doctor or a bodyguard. She wasn't one of the famous friends whose names ended up in every book about him. But Nancy Rooks may have been the only person truly inside Graceland during the hours that mattered most. For 10 years, she cooked his meals and cleaned his rooms, working the late shift from 5 in the evening until 1 in the morning, moving quietly through the mansion while the rest of Memphis slept. And on the day Elvis Presley died, she was the only maid in the house. One of the other women was sick. Another had gone home to rest. So it was Nancy, alone, walking those halls that Tuesday in August of 1977. She was the first person called when something went wrong upstairs. And for years, almost no one asked her what she saw. She loved him like family, she always said. But she also saw the parts the cameras never reached. So if anyone knew how the king really spent his final hours, it was the woman who cleaned his home. For most of her life, Nancy said very little. The official story was simple enough. Elvis died of heart failure on August 16, 1977, found in his bathroom at Graceland. A tragic end for a man who had carried decades of fame, illness, and exhaustion. To the world, it was sad but settled. But to Nancy, who had watched him decline up close, the simple version always left things out. And once she finally started to talk, the small details she remembered began to feel a lot heavier than anyone expected. The morning Elvis came home for the last time, he wasn't looking for company. He came in early from a late night out at a Memphis racket club, one of his bodyguards beside him. Nancy was there in the kitchen. She offered to make him breakfast, the way she had 1,000 times before. But he turned it down. He didn't want food. He just wanted water, and he just wanted sleep. He stood for a moment near the steps that led upstairs to his private rooms, the part of Graceland almost no one was allowed into. Then he went up. That was the last ordinary moment in the house. A tired man asking for a glass of water before bed. Nancy went back to her work, the way she always did. She had no reason to think the day would become the one the whole world remembered. But the quiet that settled over the upstairs that afternoon was the wrong kind of quiet. The call came through the kitchen intercom. It was Ginger Alden, Elvis's fiancée, and her voice was not calm. Something was wrong upstairs. Nancy didn't wait. She moved fast, up those forbidden stairs and toward the master bathroom. And what she found there is the image she would carry for the rest of her life. Elvis on the bathroom floor. Not resting, not sleeping, but unresponsive and unmoving. The most famous entertainer alive, the man whose voice filled stadiums, lying still in the one room where no audience would ever see him. Nancy was one of the very first people in the world to know that the king was gone. Before the headlines, before the crowds gathering outside the gates of Graceland, before a generation learned the news on the radio, there was a maid on a bathroom floor trying to understand what she was looking at. The room itself bothered people for years afterward. Elvis wasn't found in his bed, the way you might expect a man who had gone upstairs to sleep. He was found on the floor of the bathroom, fallen, as if something had hit him suddenly while he was alone. There was no warning anyone downstairs had heard, no call for help that reached the kitchen until it was already too late. For a house that always had people in it, bodyguards, family, staff, guests at all hours, the strangest part was how alone he had been at the end. Nancy never dressed it up. She described what she saw plainly, without drama, but the plainness was part of what made it land. A quiet room, a still figure, and a silence that had lasted too long before anyone knew to break it. How long had he been lying there before that intercom buzzed in the kitchen? It was the kind of question that has no comfortable answer. To understand why nothing about that morning sat right with the people closest to him, you have to understand the months that came before it. The Elvis the public saw on stage in those final years was not the Elvis inside Graceland. A live-in employee sees the truth that fans never do. The prescriptions that arrived. The doctors who came and went at odd hours. The way his body had swollen and slowed under years of medication and hard living and sleepless nights, flipped backward, awake when the world slept and asleep when it woke. Nancy watched a man in genuine decline, not the golden figure from the records and the films. By those final months, he was exhausted in a way rest could not fix, leaning on his staff for the smallest things. A man who had once electrified the planet, now struggling to move through his own home. He was only 42 years old, and yet those who cooked for him and cleaned for him could see he carried something much older than his years. The gap between the man on the stage and the man on the stairs had grown into a canyon. The voice was still there when he needed it. The body underneath it was failing, and the people paid to keep him comfortable could see the edge coming long before the public ever would. And the prescriptions were the part that haunted the story longest. In the months before he died, an extraordinary number of pills had been written out in Elvis's name. Sleeping medications, painkillers, stimulants to wake him up, and sedatives to put him back down. A chemical schedule that kept a failing body running. His personal physician, the man the world would come to know as Dr. Nick, became one of the most argued about figures in the entire case, later facing a board over the sheer volume of drugs he had authorized. Nancy wasn't in the examination rooms. She didn't write the scripts and couldn't have stopped them, but she lived inside the rhythm those pills created. She saw a man asleep at strange hours and awake at stranger ones, a household quietly organized around medication, and she understood, the way the staff always understands, that something about it was not sustainable. The question everyone would ask for decades was simple and terrible. If this many people could see the danger, why did no one manage to pull him back from it before that Tuesday morning? The official ruling was heart failure. A worn-out heart in a worn-out body, gone too soon, but gone naturally. For a while, that was the version the world accepted. But the question started almost immediately, and they refused to go away. Because the talk around Memphis, and soon around the world, wasn't only about a tired heart, it was about the pills. About how many prescriptions had been written in the months before, and by whom. About whether the drugs in his system had played a far bigger role than the first ruling ever admitted. The autopsy was private, paid for by the family, and its full findings were sealed away from public view for decades. And whenever a death is this famous, and the records are locked this tight, the doubt only grows louder. Was it really just his heart giving out? Or was the truth something the people around him preferred to keep behind the gates of Graceland, sealed up the same way the autopsy was? This is where the story stops being only rumor, because the record itself never settled. In 1994, nearly 2 decades after that day, the case was formally re-examined. The Tennessee medical examiner reviewed the evidence and publicly defended the original finding, ruling the death the result of natural cardiac causes. That should have closed the book, but it didn't. Other medical voices, including doctors who had studied the original toxicology reports, argued the opposite, pointing to the heavy mix of prescription drugs found in his body as the real cause of death. So you had an official ruling on one side, and serious, credentialed medical disagreement on the other, decades apart, looking at the same evidence and reaching opposite conclusions. Think about how rare that is. The fact that trained experts could study the same death and still walk away disagreeing tells you exactly how murky those final hours really were. Nancy didn't claim to solve any of it. She wasn't a coroner and never pretended to be. But she had watched the slow decline that those experts were now arguing about from inside the house every single night. And she knew it had been real long before any panel reviewed a file. If you're finding this story as haunting as I do, take a second to subscribe. I dig into the people history left standing in the background every week. For years, Nancy kept most of it to herself. She wasn't chasing cameras or book deals. She went on working at Graceland even after Elvis was gone, dusting the same rooms, walking the same halls, living beside the memory of the man she had found. But late in life, something shifted, and she finally began to write it down. Her book, Inside Graceland, told the story from the one angle almost no one else could offer: the daily, ground-level view of life and death inside that mansion. She wrote about rushing upstairs after Ginger's frantic call. She wrote about the routines, the late-night kindness, the man behind the legend. And her telling was never sensational. It was simple, almost gentle, which is exactly why so many serious Elvis researchers kept coming back to it. She wasn't trying to sell a conspiracy. She was just telling the truth as she had lived it. And a quiet truth from someone who was actually there carries a weight that the louder voices never reach. She spent 45 years patiently answering people's questions about those days. Then in 2022, she died, one day before the anniversary of the King's death. The woman who found Elvis left the world almost exactly when he had, decades later, the two dates nearly touching, as if the story had quietly closed its own circle. So what does her story really reveal, in the end? Not a murder, not a grand cover-up with a villain at the center. Something quieter, and somehow sadder. It reveals a man surrounded by people who was profoundly, dangerously alone. Elvis had bodyguards at the door and family in the house, and a fiancé just down the hall, and still he slipped away on a bathroom floor with no one beside him until it was already over. He had more wealth and more love from strangers than almost anyone who has ever lived. None of it protected him. He needed help that all the fame in the world could not buy, and the people closest to him could see it coming and could not stop it. Nancy saw all of that. She saw the decline, the loneliness behind the gates, the slow unraveling of a man the whole world thought it knew completely. And maybe that's what hurts the most about her account. Not that it points a finger at anyone, but that it doesn't have to. In the end, the king of rock and roll died the way too many of the brightest ones do, surrounded by everything except the one thing that might have saved him. And the only person who told it plainly, without trying to sell us anything, was the woman who cooked his meals and cleaned his home, and never stopped loving him long after he was gone.